Of all of the arguments for the existence of God, perhaps the most famous arguments are those taken from the 13th century Christian saint and philosopher St. Thomas Aquinas. Now, these arguments are put forward in his book called the Summa Theologia, which is the most famous work of his, though he does have other works that are well known and influential in both the development of philosophy and theology. The Summa Contra Gentiles is perhaps the second most influential work of Aquinas. And in this series, we're going to be looking at the 5 ways, the 5 proofs of the existence of God that St. Thomas Aquinas does give us in the Summa. Now, before we get started, I want to say one thing about Aquinas that's really important to know, and that is this work, the Summa, as it's often summarized as, is not primarily a philosophical argument for God's existence or the truths of the Christian faith. Summa Contra Gentiles actually does do that, but the Summa is not meant to do that. The Summa is a summary of theology, just as the title of the work suggests. So it's really a work of theology rather than philosophy, though it is certainly packed with all sorts of philosophical arguments and terminology. But what you find here is short paragraphs, these 5 short paragraphs in which Aquinas gives these 5 basic arguments for why God exists or how we can know that God exists. But these arguments don't stand alone. These ideas are developed much further on throughout Aquinas' work, in this work as well as his other works. And it's unfortunate that when people address Aquinas' arguments today, if you look at something like the New Atheist that got popular in the beginning of the 21st century, if you look at their work, they often interact with Aquinas' arguments, but they do it by looking at these isolated paragraphs in the beginning of this particular work without actually looking at the context of Aquinas' thought or the rest of what he has to say on these particular arguments. And because of that, they really misunderstand the point, or the many points, that Aquinas is actually making. So the first thing we have to note is that this isn't all Aquinas has to say about these things. He's not writing this as some kind of apologetic work toward atheists, which really didn't exist in any prominent sense in the 13th century Western world. So with that in mind, we are going to take a look at the first argument that Aquinas presents to us. And so Aquinas presents this as the argument from motion. And he says this: "It is certain and evident to our senses that in the world some things are in motion. Now whatever is moved by another, for nothing can be moved except its potentiality to that toward which it is moved. Whereas a thing moves inasmuch as it is in act. For motion is nothing else than the reduction of something from potentiality to actuality." So let's just unpack a little bit of what Thomas is trying to tell us here by using this language of act and potency, which is common in Thomas's thought, which really comes from the philosophy of Aristotle. So the idea is basically this: all things that exist are a mixture of both act and potency, or what we think of as potentiality. And in that way, all things that exist are in some sort of state, but also could be moved to some kind of other state. They have a potential to be something else. For example, I have a mug in my hand right now, and in actuality, this mug is in the grasp of my fingers, and it's being lifted up a few inches above my desk. Now, it has the potential to do and be all sorts of other things. For example, it has the potentiality to be smashed if I were to throw it against the wall. And if I threw the mug against the wall, that potentiality of this mug to be smashed would become actualized. And right now, that potentiality is just there in potential, but it's not actually actualized at this moment, as I haven't thrown my mug against the wall because I happen to like my mug and don't really want to smash it against the wall. Nonetheless, we know that it's a part of the property of what the mug is and what it's made out of, that it has the ability to be smashed. And everything that exists in the world is a mixture of act and potentiality. So we know that anything that exists has a potential to be something else. It has a potential to be moved. It has the potential to, for example, for a temperature of an object to change. It has the potential to be broken in one way or another. And that's simply the reality that we live in a contingent world of material objects. They're all a mixture of act and potentiality. So that's the most important thing you have to understand. Now, for Aquinas, God himself is not a mixture of act and potency, but God is what theologians would call pure act or pure actuality. So with that in mind, we look at what Aquinas sees as a very basic metaphysical principle, or a principle of reality, of all that exists. And that is that everything that is moved by another. In other words, if there is a potentiality in an object or thing in this world, that potentiality, if it is actualized by something else. It does not actualize itself, right? My mug is not going to actualize its potentiality to be smashed. It's not going to jump off the desk suddenly by itself and its own power and smash against the wall. If that were to happen, there would have had to have been some cause, whether it's a human cause, whether there was an earthquake, or whether it was just precarious on a shelf and happened to fall. There is some kind of external cause that is causing that potentiality for the mug to be smashed to actualize itself. And in his explanation, Aquinas gives the following example to try to bear this point out. And that is an example of fire and wood. And he says that fire is actually hot, but wood is only hot in potentiality. And so we could have wood that has no fire on it, and that wood wouldn't necessarily be hot. And in order for it to become hot, if we place the fire onto the wood, it would then actualize that potentiality of the wood itself to be hot. And Aquinas then makes this point. He says, for what is actually hot cannot simultaneously be potentially hot. In other words, if the wood was already hot, it could not have the potentiality to be hot because it would already be hot. But it is simultaneously potentially cold. Okay, so wood would be potentially cold or potentially hot. This is true of any object, as temperature can change. And he says this, it is therefore impossible that in the same respect, in the same way, a thing should be both mover and moved, i.e., that it should move itself. Right, so a wood itself cannot be both actually hot and potentially hot at the same time. It is either actually hot or potentially hot. And for the potentiality of the wood to become hot were actualized by the wood itself, then it would have to both be hot in order to make itself hot and also have the potentiality to become hot. And that, of course, is an impossibility. So we know that in objects like wood, something has to happen externally to that object in order for it to change. And this is true of everything that exists in the world. And so the point that he makes after all of this is to say that because there is motion in the world, because there are these changes from potentiality to actuality, and because things do not actualize themselves, but they must be actualized by something outside of themselves, there must be an unmoved mover. There must be a source of motion that exists outside of this world of motion that gives the power of motion to the things in this universe. Now, it's important to say that Aquinas' principle that he outlines here, his metaphysical principle that everything that is moved by another, is not a universal principle that relates to absolutely everything that exists, because he doesn't apply it to God himself. The point is this, that contingent things, material things, things in this universe, anything that is a mixture of act and potency cannot move itself. It must have an external cause or an external source of motion. And so everything that exists that is a mixture of act and potency must have some kind of cause for its potentiality to become actualized. Now, what that does leave open is the possibility that, and even the necessity, that there is one who is pure act, that doesn't have potential, that has not yet been actualized. It's simply to say that the nature of the material world, being a mixture of act and potency, cannot give itself motion. It must come from somewhere else. And this is where it comes from is, as Aquinas says, God, who he describes here as the unmoved mover, one who moves other things without himself being moved at all. Now, the way that philosophers often have tried to get around this is to try to argue for an infinite regress. Aquinas has been criticized for positing that there cannot be an infinite regress of things or of causes. And some would say, for example, that if an object is moved by something outside of itself, it is further moved by something outside of itself, and further moved by something outside of itself. And essentially what's argued for is an infinite chain of causes. And it's said that there could just be an infinite chain of causes. There does not need to be a beginning of this chain of causes that is God, that Aquinas posits, but perhaps the universe has always existed, and there have always been things causing other things. Well, the first point I want to make to that is that Aquinas doesn't actually deal with the temporal beginning of the universe. He's not dealing with causation or motion just on a horizontal temporal level. In fact, Aquinas himself believes that you can't really argue philosophically, definitively, that the universe itself has a beginning. He believes that's true because Scripture says it in special revelation. But in terms of just philosophy by itself, he does not believe that that can be demonstrated. Now, there have been philosophical arguments we won't get into here that do try to make an argument that the universe must have a kind of beginning. But for Aquinas, that's not really the point of the argument. And so rather than in a horizontal sense, think of it as in a vertical sense. At any moment, when anything is doing anything or being moved in any way, there is something at that moment which has caused its motion. And so if we think of it in that sense, we can't really get around the problem by simply saying, well, temporally, everything has always existed. And that really would avoid the question as a whole, because the question really is this. You can't have a bunch of contingent things that all move other things when none of them has the power of motion purely in themselves. Because what you have is a bunch of things that don't have the power of motion moving other things. So the power of motion itself must come from something. So think about it in this way. This has been an example that's used sometimes to argue against this notion of infinite regress. Picture cars on a train. Now, train cars are all moved because of the car that is in front, that has the engine, that has the power to move the cars that are behind it. Now, if I were to say that there was a train that just kept moving, and to say that there are just a bunch of train cars, an infinite number of train cars, and I said, well, they just move because this one's moved by this one, that's moved by this one, that's moved by this one, that's moved by this one, we would know inherently that that's illogical. You can't have a number of train cars that don't have anything that is actually moving those cars at all. In the same way, you would say that about, for example, someone who is making a painting. If you see a brush that is painting a picture, it doesn't solve the problem of motion to say, well, who's painting the picture? To say, well, the brush is painting it. Well, where does the brush end? And say, well, the brush is infinite. So there's no one actually giving motion to the paintbrush. It just keeps going on and on forever. You see, it doesn't actually solve the problem. And so the power of motion itself has to come from somewhere. So it's not a question of whether there are this many physical objects in the universe or how long the physical universe has existed, but where does the source, the power of motion itself come from? And as Aquinas argues, it comes from one who we call God. If you want to look more into these arguments, I will provide some links to some resources you can look at that get much more in depth and deal with all sorts of objections. And if you'd like me to keep doing this series, I would really enjoy doing all of Aquinas' proofs and perhaps getting into some other proofs for the existence of God. So just let me know what you guys think. Like, share, subscribe if you want to see more theological and philosophical content. Thanks so much. We'll see you next time.